You know that moment when you realize you've been personally victimized by stucco and solar glare? That was me, last Tuesday. It was 107 degrees in the shade, if you could find any shade in this blindingly beige, meticulously manicured corner of suburban America. I'm Leo, and my current reality felt like living inside a convection oven set to broil. I was standing on my patch of dying Bermuda grass, dripping sweat onto my Crocs. My oasis, my sanctuary, my 10-foot, $49.99 Intex Easy Set inflatable ring pool, which I had lovingly nicknamed the Blue Omen, was now a tragic, deflated pile of PVC regret. Let me tell you about the Blue Omen. It wasn't Olympic-sized or even particularly clean after a week, but it was glorious. It was the only thing standing between me and heat-stroke-induced insanity. It was deep enough to fully submerge myself while standing on my knees, achieving what I called full aquatic reset mode. The slight instability of the top ring, which always threatened catastrophic collapse, just added a thrill, didn't it? It was cheap utility, pure and beautiful. The perfect suburban rebellion. Then the letter arrived. It was crisp, heavy stock, delivered by a woman in a visor who wouldn't make eye contact. It was from the Holy Order of Aesthetics, my homeowners association, the Holy Order of Aesthetics. I swear, they name these things just to make you feel spiritually inferior for owning a dented Weber grill. The letter, let me read the highlight reel, because I kept it, framed it even, was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive legalese. Dear Occupant 412, we regret to inform you that your temporary water retention structure, hereinafter referred to as the unsightly aqueous implement, is in violation of Section 7.b of the Master Community Covenant. I reread that line, interjecting my own commentary. Unsightly aqueous implements. I swear they hire lawyers who specialize in disappointing children. The specific offense? The reason they banned my pool, forcing me to suffer through this heat wave like some sun-baked pilgrim? Not the noise, not the splashing, not even the sheer vulgarity of my presence. It was a small, faded, slightly yellow-brown scorch mark on the grass directly under where the pool had been. The letter continued. Furthermore, the resulting grass degradation is deemed a violation of landscaping standards, necessitating the immediate removal of the unsightly aqueous implement and remediation of the sod. Remediation of the sod? They were going to make me replace a square foot of dead grass caused by water. The sheer distilled pettiness of it made my blood pressure spike like a toddler on pixie sticks. That was the boiling point. The moment the idea sparked, I could have just bought a smaller pool. I could have moved the current one. I could have just put down new sod and kept my mouth shut. But why be sensible when you can be defiant? Why be compliant when you can be architectural? Grabbed my phone and called Mickey. Mickey is my friend and confidant, and he's useless but supportive. He's the guy you call when you want someone to confirm that yes, you are a genius, and no, you're not overreacting. They won, Mick, I said, pacing my airless living room. The HOA got you? Man, I told you the blue plastic was too vibrant for their beige souls. Worse. They banned the concept of temporary water retention. They called it an unsightly aqueous implement. Mickey, that's a direct attack on my right to affordable self-cooling. Mickey whistled. What are you going to do? Build a fountain? No. I'm going to comply, I said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. They banned a pool. They didn't ban a moat. A moat is not a temporary water retention structure. A moat is an architectural feature, a permanent, defensible, historically significant, non-recreational architectural feature. Dude, you cannot dig a moat. Oh, I can. And I will, I vowed, picking up a shovel I hadn't used since I moved in. They want an aesthetic? I'll give them an aesthetic, a defensive one, and it's going to glow. They will regret ever mentioning the word aesthetic to me. The war was on. The enemy was Mrs. Henderson, HOA treasurer, and her absurdly crisp stationery. The next 72 hours were a blur of caffeine, screen glare, and what I can only describe as an aggressive deep dive into the bureaucratic nightmare that is American residential law. Forget binge-watching Netflix. I was binge-reading the municipal code for the city of Pleasantville, Section 4, Subsection G, Permanent Decorative Landscape Water Features. This is where the magic happened. See, pool implies fun. Pool implies bathing suits and splashing and liability. Moat, or more accurately, the code-approved decorative water basin with an integrated subterranean drainage component, implies medieval commitment and highly structured landscaping. They banned the fun one. I discovered that while any swimming or bathing pool over 18 inches deep required fencing, permits, and a $500 application fee, a decorative, non-recreational water feature was subject only to setback rules and general safety guidelines. The key phrase was non-recreational. If I could prove no one would ever, under any circumstance, use it to splash, I was golden. It was a dry legal distinction, but I was going to make it soaking wet. Leo explaining the discovery to the reader. It was like finding the cheat code in a terribly designed video game. I wasn't building a pool. I was installing an anti-swimming apparatus. I wasn't going to frolic in it. I was going to contemplate the depths of my spite in it. My first design draft was done using the only supplies available: a ruler, a sheet of graph paper, and a box of neon crayons I found under the couch. The blueprint, which I titled The Fortification of 4012, called for a 3-foot-deep, 6-foot-wide channel, fully encircling the house. I also added a detailed schematic of the low-voltage, marine-grade, color-changing LED strips I planned to hide beneath the waterline. Purple was the default setting, obviously. Pure visual offense. Next, I needed to bait the enemy. I fired off a polite, professional email to the HOA management, the Holy Order of Aesthetics, pretending to be a model citizen. Subject: inquiry regarding landscape water retention features. Dear HOA Board, due to the unforeseen erosion issues in my rear quadrant, I am considering the installation of a permanent, landscaped, non-recreational, curvilinear water retention feature to stabilize the property's aesthetic flow. Could you please provide clarification on the maximum dimensions and any covenants related to permanent, lighted landscape features of a defensive and contemplative nature? Sincerely, Leo R. Occupant, 412. I got a response 3 days later. It was a boilerplate, non-committal reply from an automated mailbox. Occupant 412, please refer to the Master Community Covenant, Section 7, Subsection B. All proposed changes must maintain the community's high aesthetic standards. Failure to comply will result in fines. No specific, no. No mention of pools or moats, just a vague reference to high aesthetic standards. Bingo. In my mind, that was tacit approval. They hadn't banned my specific, permanent, contemplative, aesthetic, defensive, curvilinear water feature. I printed the email and laminated it. It was now my golden ticket. The next hurdle was finding a contractor. This became a hilarious sequence of phone calls. I couldn't exactly post an ad. Wanted? Excavator to dig spite moat around single-family ranch. I contacted 3 local landscaping excavation companies. Call 1. Dirt Digglers and Sons. Me. Yes, I'm looking for an estimate on a trench. 3 feet deep, 6 feet wide, completely encircling my property. Dirt Digglers. Lady. A perimeter fence line? Me. No fence. It's a water feature. For retention. DDL. Retention of what? Me. Of the structure's visual boundaries. She said they'd call me back. They didn't. Call 2. Grizzled Gary's excavation. Me. Hi, Gary. I need a deep, continuous channel dug around my home. It's for a defensive perimeter. Grizzled Gary. A pause so long I could hear his truck idling. A defensive perimeter. Son, are you planning on getting raided by a medieval tax collector? Me. It's for aesthetic compliance, Gary. I need to deter unsightly aqueous implements. Grizzled Gary. Hangs up mid-sentence. I was about to give up when I found Contractor 3, Chadwick's Custom Concrete and Conceptual Excavation. His website had a portfolio that included a concrete sculpture of a dragon bursting out of a retaining wall. He seemed open-minded. I met Chadwick in my driveway. He was younger than I expected, wearing reflective sunglasses and a neon green t-shirt that said, "Dig deep, think shallow." "Chadwick," I said, shaking his mud-stained hand. "I have a conceptual project for you." "Lay it on me, man. I'm sick of digging holes for perfectly good trampolines." I laid out the plan, using the word moat only after extensive verbal cushioning. "A moat?" Chadwick's eyes widened, but not with horror, with glee. "Man, that is conceptual. That is a statement piece. We can do that, but the filled dirt removal is going to be extra. Think of it as performance art. We're removing the past to make way for the future of pettiness." "Performance art is exactly what it is, Chadwick," I confirmed. He scribbled numbers on a napkin, coming up with an absurdly high quote, about 40 times the cost of the inflatable pool. But the pride in his eyes was priceless. "We start Monday. We'll call this project the Renaissance of Resistance," he declared. "I like it," I said, "but I'm calling it the Purple Perimeter of Petty Resistance, just so you know." "Dope," he replied, and we shook on a handshake that cemented my commitment to architectural absurdity. Monday morning, 7:00 a.m. Sharp. My quiet, boring, meticulously maintained suburban street was absolutely annihilated. The scene was pure chaos. A massive mini-excavator, the kind you usually see on commercial sites, not parked next to a Subaru, blocked half the road. A dump truck idled menacingly behind it. Chadwick arrived wearing safety goggles, a tie-dye bandana, and blasting an aggressive medley of 80s arena rock from a speaker the size of a microwave. I think it was Def Leppard. Leo's internal monologue watching the scene. My life went from mildly annoyed to starring in a low-budget disaster movie in about 3 minutes flat. This was less a landscape change and more a hostile invasion of my own lawn. The first scoop of dirt, a glorious, chunky pile of clay and roots, was lifted, and that was the dinner bell for the neighborhood. Within 10 minutes, Mrs. Henderson, the HOA treasurer and high priestess of the Beige Order, materialized on my driveway. She didn't walk. She glided like a tightly wound hovercraft, radiating pure distilled disapproval. She was wearing a matching lavender tracksuit, and her expression could curdle milk. "Mr. Reynolds!" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the bass line of "pour some sugar on me." What in God's name is this disruption? I walked over calmly, adopting my chosen persona for this project, the pretentious artist. "Ah, Mrs. Henderson. Good morning," I chirped. "Isn't it marvelous? This is the start of the Zen-inspired curvilinear negative space installation I mentioned vaguely in my email." She squinted at the growing pile of displaced earth. "It looks like a trench. You're digging a trench around your home. That is a hazard. It violates the setback requirements for permanent structures." "Ah, the beauty of deconstructivism," I countered, waving a hand dismissively. "It's not a trench, Mrs. Henderson. A trench implies utility. This is a deliberate aesthetic demarcation of my private sphere. It separates the rigidity of suburban expectation from the organic flow of my personal property rights." I made sure to use the word aesthetic as many times as possible. She sputtered. "It's a ditch. You are digging a ditch." "Only if you view it through a lens of historical conventionality," I said, leaning in conspiratorially. "Think of it as the inverse of a retaining wall. Instead of retaining the earth, it retains the gaze. It challenges the observer's perception of spatial security." She threw her hands up and stormed back toward her house, presumably to consult the Master Community Covenant for the definition of contemplative waiting. Meanwhile, the construction continued in glorious anarchy. Chadwick's crew consisted of himself and a 20-year-old kid named Dusty, who looked permanently confused. They were incompetent, but endearing. "Chadwick, you just severed that line," I yelled over the Def Leppard track, pointing at a small fountain of water that suddenly erupted near the front porch. "Relax, Leo. That's just the sprinkler line. We'll cap it later. It's adding a little spontaneous water feature element to the design, you know?" Chadwick yelled back mid-air as he swung the excavator arm. Dusty, covered head to toe in mud, leaned against the dump truck. I went over to check on him. "You okay, Dusty? What was that PVC pipe you just crushed?" "I don't know, man," Dusty replied, staring into the middle distance. "It's deep, you know? Like, we think we own this land, but all this dirt, it's just telling a story. A story about soil displacement. We're removing the past to make way for the future of pettiness." He had clearly internalized Chadwick's mission statement. I realized I wasn't just managing a construction crew, I was funding a comedy troupe's avant-garde land art project. The first major interruption arrived around noon. A non-emergency call had led to the arrival of 2 bored local patrol officers, Officer Miller, young and keen, and Officer Jenkins, older and just hoping his shift would end quietly. They parked their cruiser near the rapidly growing mound of fill dirt. "Sir," Officer Miller began, adjusting his belt, "we've received a complaint about unauthorized heavy machinery and a potentially dangerous open trench." I calmly walked over, wiping sweat from my face. "Officers, I completely understand the confusion. I'm Leo Reynolds, and this is not an open trench. It's a structural perimeter enhancement." "Right," Jenkins sighed, looking skeptical. "We need to see your permits for this excavation, sir." This was the moment. I produced the laminated copy of the vague zoning documents and, crucially, the HOA's non-committal email about aesthetic standards. "Officers, this is not a structure requiring a building permit. It's a decorative water basin under City Code 4G, much like a large koi pond, which requires only a zoning variance if over 3,000 gallons. I've filed the variance request. Furthermore," I continued, pointing to the HOA email, "my community association has been notified that this is a permanent contemplative water retention feature, and they raised no specific objection to the concept. Miller looked at Jenkins. Jenkins looked at the gigantic, muddy hole surrounding my house. "So, this isn't a construction site?" Miller asked. "It's a landscape modification," I corrected gently. Is that for drainage, sir?" Officer Miller asked, pointing to the rapidly pooling water in the ditch. I shook my head slowly, meeting his gaze. "It drains the spirit of mediocrity, officer. That's its primary function. It's a symbolic boundary." The officers exchanged weary glances. They realized they were caught in a bureaucratic turf war, not a police matter. "Sir, we can't stop you from doing landscaping, but keep the noise down," Jenkins finally conceded. "And you need to rope off that hole, or someone's going to sue the city." "Perfectly understandable, officer," I said, and watched them drive away, completely baffled. The sergeant hadn't arrived yet, but I knew the fight wasn't over. By sunset, the trench was complete. It was rough, uneven, and utterly massive. The sun glinted off the muddy water pooled at the bottom. My house now officially had a deep, emotional scar around it. Leo's closing thought for the section. My house now officially had a deep, emotional scar around it. Next step, hydration. The moat was dug. Now I just needed to fill it and make it glow like a fever dream. The moat was dug, but it was just a muddy, 6-foot-wide hole. It was functional as an anti-HOA statement, but aesthetically, it was currently lacking. It needed two things: waterproofing and spectacle. Waterproofing meant the industrial-strength pond liner. I had purchased 200 pounds of heavy-duty EPDM rubber, which arrived folded into a dense, oily cube of pure resistance. Installing the liner was a fiasco that made the excavation look like a delicate ballet. Chadwick and Dusty were gone, off to their next conceptual job, installing a concrete pyramid as a shed. So it was just me. I wrestled with the massive sheet in the 100-degree heat. The rubber was slick and unyielding. Every time I managed to smooth out one side, the other would spring back, creating a ridge that looked like a geological fault line. I crawled in the moat, cursing under my breath, trying to fold the corners neatly. Inner monologue comparing the liner installation to wrestling a giant, sweaty manta ray. This wasn't landscaping. This was an athletic competition against inanimate petroleum products. I looked like a drowning man trying to hug a tire. The sweat was mixing with the oily liner residue, creating a dark, shiny film. I was basically a suburban swamp thing, trying to contain the water that would eventually contain me. After 2 hours, my clothes were stuck to me, and the liner was mostly in place, smoothed out with only a few, strategically placed wrinkles that I convinced myself added character. With the basin waterproofed, it was time for the spectacle, the color-changing LED strips. I needed a completely concealed, low-voltage, app-controlled lighting system, something that screamed sophisticated security feature, but behaved like a disco ball on steroids. This required calling in an actual nervous professional. Mark the electrician. Mark was a stickler for code, safety, and common sense, 3 things I had abandoned weeks ago. When Mark showed up, he stared into the black, lined moat, then looked at my suburban ranch house, then back at the moat. He repeated this cycle 3 times. "Mr. Reynolds," Mark said, pushing his glasses up his nose, his voice barely a whisper of professional concern. "You want me to run marine-grade, submersible, multicolored, theatrical lighting into the perimeter trench around the house?" "It's not a trench, Mark. It's a decorative, contemplative water basin," I corrected him cheerfully. "And yes, completely concealed, low voltage, and I need a dedicated breaker for the controller, capable of handling an aggressive strobe setting. Mark swallowed hard. Dialogue with Mark the electrician. So, just to confirm, he said, pulling out his clipboard, we're waterproofing these multicolored theatrical lights into the trench, around the house, and you need them to flash? It's about ambiance, Mark, and defiance, I explained. When the HOA looks out here, I want them to see a glowing, unwavering statement that my property rights are non-negotiable. I need that subtle hum of low-voltage aesthetic threat. Mark spent the next day running the conduit, shaking his head the whole time. He didn't say much, but every time I passed him, I heard him mutter the same thing. This is not standard. Once the wiring was complete, the final step was the filling. This was the expensive, slow, and publicly noticeable part. I turned on multiple hoses, letting them run full blast. The water meter outside my house started spinning like a slot machine that had just hit the suburban jackpot. The moat held the water perfectly, swelling from a muddy crease to a massive, dark ribbon of liquid commitment. After about 8 hours, I got a call from the local water company. Dialogue with the water company. Representative. Mr. Reynolds, we noticed an unusual spike in your residential water usage. Are you aware of this? It indicates a potential leak of about 1,000 gallons per hour. Me. Yes, I am aware, thank you. There is no leak. I am currently performing a necessary high-volume fill for a newly installed permanent landscape water retention feature. Representative. A pool? Me. No, ma'am. A decorative, contemplative water basin. Representative. A long silence. Is that a fire safety feature? Me. In a way, yes. It puts out the fire of petty oppression. Representative. Sir, I'm just going to flag your account for manual review. I'm hung up, a little richer in water debt, but much closer to victory. Finally, at 9:00 p.m., with the moon high and the air thick with humidity, the moat was full. The water was still settling, but the surface was glassy. I stood in my front yard, heart pounding, holding the app in my hand. This was the moment of the grand reveal. I hit the on button, and it was glorious. The water immediately erupted in a blinding, aggressive shade of deep, angry, HOA antagonizing purple. The light wasn't just on the surface. It glowed from the depths, illuminating the slightly murky water like some kind of portal to a highly specific, low-budget fantasy realm. The light reflected off the stucco walls of my house, bathing the entire property in a hostile, neon glow. I threw my head back and let out a triumphant cry. Behold the purple perimeter of petty resistance. Take that, Article 2, Section B. May your aesthetic standards be forever violated by my theatrical lighting. The sheer absurdity of the spectacle. A perfectly maintained suburban home surrounded by a glowing medieval defense was intoxicating. I had not only complied with the letter of the law, but had done so with a flourish that ensured maximum unforgettable annoyance. My moat was alive. The purple glow of the moat was the bat signal for bureaucratic disaster. It took exactly 18 hours for the official response to arrive. This time, Mrs. Henderson was not alone. She returned the following afternoon, her lavender tracksuit replaced by a slightly more formal but equally aggressive beige pantsuit. With her was Mr. Denton, a city planning safety department representative. Denton looked like a man whose entire diet consisted of spreadsheets and unseasoned chicken breast. He carried a clipboard like a shield. The formal complaint. Mr. Reynolds, Denton began, his voice flat and devoid of human emotion. We have received a formal complaint regarding your— He paused, checking his notes with distaste. Your perimeter water feature. Specifically, we're citing the potential for mosquito propagation and unauthorized aquatic life. I was ready. I'd seen this coming. I calmly produced a receipt from my back pocket. Dialogue with Mr. Denton. Mr. Denton, I said politely. I addressed the potential for mosquito propagation at 1:30 p.m. yesterday. Here is the receipt for my mosquito-repelling LED reactive water cleansing algae inhibitor. It's a specialty high-end product designed for, quote, non-recreational aesthetic water basins. The receipt proves I purchased and applied the treatment 30 minutes before Mrs. Henderson filed this complaint. Denton stared at the receipt, his eyes darting between the product name and Mrs. Henderson, who was radiating pure indignation. But the water, Denton stammered, pointing a pen at the moat, which I had currently set to a sickly, pulsating yellow-green. The depth and width. It constitutes a hazard. The depth of 3 feet necessitates a fence. Under Section 7D, any body of water over 24 inches deep requires a code-compliant barrier. This was the core of the fight, the depth and width argument. Ah, but that ordinance refers to recreational immersion structures, Mr. Denton, I argued, tapping my laminated HOA email. This is not for recreation. I guarantee you I will never immerse recreationally in my decorative contemplative water basin. Furthermore, it's not 3 feet deep, sir. It's 3 feet of artistic freedom. The actual water level is maintained at a safe, non-immersive 2 feet and 3 inches, specifically to avoid the 24-inch threshold. We spent the next 15 minutes arguing over the difference between recreational immersion and contemplative wading. A ditch is a ditch, sir, Denton insisted, his face slightly red. A ditch is purely functional, Mr. Denton. This is aesthetic. It's designed to be observed, not used. Would you classify the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C. as a ditch? I challenged. Denton was furious, but he was stuck. The HOA's initial failure to specifically ban a moat had left a giant, glowing legal loophole. Then, the final, inevitable hammer fell. Cops. Part 2. The Escalation. The 2 patrol officers from Section 3, Miller and Jenkins, pulled up again. This time, they were accompanied by a very large, very weary sergeant, a man who looked like he had been mediating disputes since the invention of the sidewalk. "All right, let's cut the drama," the sergeant said, walking toward us with the heavy tread of a man who just wants to go home and eat an early dinner. "I was told there was a civilian emergency and a possible breach of the peace. Mr. Reynolds, what is the nature of this structure?" "Sergeant," I said, meeting his gaze honestly, "this is a permanent decorative water feature. I was complying with the aesthetic guidelines of a water feature. My inflatable pool was banned, and I simply replaced it with an architecturally compliant, non-recreational alternative that happens to be 3 feet deep and surrounds my house." The sergeant stared at the moat, then at Denton's red face, then at Mrs. Henderson's pinched expression. "You're saying you built a moat because they banned your pool," he summarized, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "In essence, yes. I didn't want the community to suffer from a lack of high aesthetic standards," I replied, using the HOA's own language against them. The sergeant sighed. He appealed to my sense of community. Dialogue with Sergeant. "Look, Mr. Reynolds, I understand you're frustrated with the HOA. We all are, but this is highly inflammatory. Can you just drain it? We'll all forget this happened." I remained polite but firm. "I can't, Sergeant. It's a permanent fixture, and I believe I have the law on my side. They banned my pool. They didn't ban my dedication to home defense architecture. The Moat defense strategy. This was the point where I executed my secret weapon. "Sergeant," Yai said, walking to the edge of the moat. "It's scorching out here. Would you gentlemen like a cold drink?" The officers, all three of them, looked parched. I reached into the moat, which was currently set to a tranquil, icy blue, and pulled out a small, inflatable inner tube. Floating in the tube were 2 cans of diet soda, perfectly chilled by the massive volume of water. "It serves a purpose, Sergeant. It's a passive geothermal cooling unit for beverages," I explained. I handed one to the sergeant. He looked at the soda, then at the glowing moat, then at Denton. He popped the tab. "Shh." "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," the sergeant mumbled, taking a long drink. He looked down at his badge number on his collar. Suddenly, I had an idea. I pulled out the app and changed the color setting. The moat flared to an intense, high-contrast white. The light, reflecting off the water surface, was aimed perfectly. "And it's a security feature," I declared, pointing. "Look, I can use the integrated high-powered LEDs to highlight any potential trespassers, or say a sergeant's badge number for identification purposes." The sergeant's badge number was dramatically illuminated by the moat's harsh white glare. He paused, soda halfway to his mouth. "Sergeant," taking a chilled soda, "look, this is highly unusual, but technically, if it's non-recreational and you can prove proper algae control, it doesn't violate the Permanent Structures Ordinance." Denton was defeated. He didn't have a code section for architectural passive-aggressive beverage chiller and theatrical security lighting. The legal stalemate. The city inspector reluctantly admitted that, while insane and certainly not what the code intended, the moat was currently compliant as a non-recreational, permanent lighted water feature. He demanded a final safety report, which I immediately called Chadwick to expedite with an emergency conceptualism fee. Leo's triumph monologue. And that, my friends, is how a 10-foot inflatable donut was reincarnated as an existential statement on property rights. I didn't just win, I achieved regulatory gridlock by weaponizing my aesthetic choices. My pool was dead. Long live the moat. The victory felt monumental, and the rest of the world agreed. The moment the sergeant took that soda from the neon green moat, a moment Mrs. Henderson had captured on her phone, only for it to be immediately counter-captured by a neighbor, it went viral. Someone posted the clip on the local subreddit titled "Homeowner Humiliates HOA with Medieval Light Show." The video racked up thousands of views, and I, Leo Reynolds, was suddenly Moat Man. Comments section read aloud by Leo. "They call me Moat Man. I prefer the Duke of Ditch, but I'll take it." One guy commented, "This is the most American thing I've ever seen." I think that's going on my gravestone. The moat, now a landmark, needed a grand opening. I decided to throw a huge, ironic moat warming party, invited the whole street. I had to. It was a non-recreational community building event. The climax arrived on a Saturday night. I rigged the moat with floating color-matched glow sticks and served blue beverages, I called them Aqua Vengeance, and used the moat as a massive color-changing cooler for beer and wine, floating them in miniature plastic sailboats. Surprisingly, people showed up. Neighbors who had previously given me the side eye, people who hated the HOA far more than they loved the color beige, came out of the woodwork. They stood around the glowing blue-green moat, marveling at the absurdity of it all. Dialogue with a neighbor. Jeff. Jeff, a retired accountant from across the street, leaned over the edge, mesmerized by the slow, shifting light. "Leo," he admitted, shaking his head, "I thought you were crazy, but this is aggressively awesome. It's like living next to a budget Disney ride." "It's the ambiance, Jeff," I said, handing him a cold Aqua Vengeance. "What color is this right now?" he asked. I checked my app, smiling. "Pure, unadulterated, spiteful cyan." He nodded, taking a thoughtful sip. "I like it. Spiteful cyan." The party was a hit, and that was the last straw for the HOA. They couldn't find me. The city inspector had basically signed off. They couldn't stop the parties. They were private gatherings. But they couldn't stop the media attention either. The local news even did a segment. "Is Moat Man a hero or a hazard?" A few days later, I received the final, defeated, and mercifully much shorter letter. It wasn't crisp. It looked like it had been printed on a tired office printer that was running low on toner. The HOA capitulates. The letter stated that the board acknowledged the structure's compliance as a permanent water feature. However, due to newly introduced noise and light pollution ordinances, clearly written just for me, they had to insist on one thing. The LEDs must be turned off at 10 p.m. Leo reading the final letter. "They won the battle of the nightlight, but they lost the war for my soul. Worth it." It was a compromise I could live with. After 10 p.m., the moat would become a dark, silent, still menacing stretch of water. It could be contemplative after all. Final reflection. Tonight, I'm sitting on my front porch, 10:01 p.m. The spiteful cyan has faded, and the moat is just a still obsidian channel reflecting the moonlight. It's ridiculous, expensive, and completely unnecessary. My bank account is lighter, my patience was tested, and I now know way too much about local zoning law. I started with a $50 inflatable pool. I ended up with a $20,000 monument to bureaucratic annoyance. Was it worth it? Absolutely. The HOA knows I'm here. My neighbors know I'm here. And every time I look out at that massive non-recreational defensive color-changing water feature, I know I defended the sacred right to coolness and common sense against the tyrannical reign of the beige. Next, summer. I'm thinking drawbridge, with an integrated sound system that plays the Def Leppard track when it lowers. That's probably another 10,000 words.